Is this issue of gender-affirming care still a very significant issue?
Yeah, it's a big problem. These practitioners continue to ignore the data that's right in front of them.
I have colleagues that just do gender transition in children. And when I approached one and I said, well, what about the long-term data out of Europe? He said, what long-term data out of Europe?
We're starting to see, of course, lawsuits by children who understand now that they've made terrible mistakes.
Pam Bondi's memo came out saying that this is gender mutilation, which is criminal.
If experts don't stand up and speak the truth, the price they will pay is way worse than the price they would pay for not being politically correct. Dr. Nazarian and Dr. Goldfarb, I'm really happy you're here at this very important moment. I think that parents, I know that parents are incredibly concerned about what's happening with the gender mutilation. And I actually looked up the statistics just before you came in. 53% of the electorate, parents that voted for Donald Trump, actually named the gender-affirming care in schools and sports as one of the three most important subjects that concerned them during the last election. And so number one being the economy and paying bills, number two, immigration and border and related to security. But really number three is the issue of our children, because we are experiencing something incredibly scary. We send our kids to school and we just don't know what's going to be told to them. And we are losing our rights as parents to defend them, and our children are losing their rights to be defended and protected by their own parents. And so I really wanted to sit with both of you leaders in this space. You've written books about this issue. You have been running against the herd, a herd that's not easy to run against because of the woke culture that has been really taken over every industry, including the medical industry. And I take this issue very, very seriously because I am a mom myself and I am seeing what is going on. And I am just unbelievably scared that if we don't stop it, we lose our country, we lose our children. So thank you for coming in. And first of all, thank you for all the fighting that you've been doing. Dr. Goldfarb, you are probably just as passionate as I am about this issue. You went ahead and started an organization, Do No Harm. And I'd love for you to just comment on what I said. Is this issue of gender-affirming care, both in sports and in schools and in medicine, still a very significant issue?
Well, it's great to be with you and Dr. Nazarian here, who's a wonderful leader in the field as well. Yeah, it's a big problem. There's no question that my organization, for example, has a database, the Stop the Harm database, that showed that we have something like 15,000 children that at least that number have gone through these treatments based on the hospitals from which we were able to gather the information. There are a lot of hospitals which we didn't have it. For example, Kaiser Permanente doesn't give their data out, or self-pay. We don't have those data, but we have insurance data. But I think as we discussed a little bit earlier even, the question is, where are we going? This is so prevalent in schools now. The National Education Association, the teachers' unions all promote these activities. And you really have to worry that when you send your child off to school, these children are being told if they have any confusion, unhappiness with their bodies, particularly young girls that are going through the early stages of puberty, suddenly they're told, we have a solution for you. We're going to change your gender. Well, they're not really changing anything. What they're doing is they're doing cosmetic surgery and they're using medications that change their physical appearance if they're still going through puberty. And the result of this is going to be a society where we're going to have many, many children that have really been harmed. And right now, we have no idea of a specific number of those who are so-called detransitioners, people like Chloe Cole, who have testified. But we know that, there was really a dramatic moment at the Federal Trade Commission hearing, I think, where the detransitioners sat up and said, look at me, look at my chest. My breasts are gone. Listen to my voice. My voice will never be the voice of a young woman because I've been put on these drugs. I've had surgical procedures, and now I terribly regret this, and I'll never be able to live a normal life. And that's what we're most concerned about. And I must say, just at the start, this is about children. This is not about adults. If adults want to pursue this kind of lifestyle, that's their business, whether it's healthy for them or safe for them or what have you. It's not for me to say, really, although there are those who feel that it is unethical to provide treatment that can be harmful. But nonetheless, our focus, and I think Dr. Nazarian's focus, has also been on children. They can't make any decisions about this. They don't. You have a 5-year-old child who says, "I want to be a cat." This is the kind of thing you're dealing with, and anybody who has teenage children knows that they're not in a position to make lifelong decisions about anything, much less the medical care that they're going to have to undergo. So this is a big problem. The numbers are there. And, the truth is, even if it were a small number, it's a terrible thing that shouldn't be foisted on children. And that's why our organization has been fighting so much against it.
Dr. Nazarian, you are a practicing plastic surgeon. So you're in it. You're in the trenches. I know that you see clients from all over the world. What is your perspective on this idea that, this gender-affirming care thing is not a big deal and, it's just some kids are doing it, but no harm really. Is it a big deal?
I think that I've learned throughout the COVID pandemic and beyond that everything doesn't stop where you think it's going to stop. So to give an inch, they're going to take a mile. Before I wasn't really political. I wasn't really involved. I wasn't an activist. I have 3 kids. I have a practice, and I was just kind of living in my own bubble. And I didn't understand, why don't we give up these guns and why don't they just give it up? Like, who cares? And I realized,
like the what they call assault rifles.
Why don't you just give up assault rifles? What's the big deal?
Yeah.
And I once we went through the COVID pandemic, I saw, okay, wear a mask. Okay, stand 6 feet apart. Okay, take the kids out of school for a while. Okay, shut down your practice for 2 months. Okay. Get a shot, get a booster. Don't come back to school unless your kid has this many. Like, they don't stop. And so what I realized is the reason why they don't give up the assault rifles is the gun lobby's not going to go away. They're going to go after the next one and the next one until we don't have any more guns. And so this whole idea of it's not a big deal, it's not affecting that many people, you have to understand, in 5 years, if we don't say something now, where are we going to be in 10 years, in 20 years? And I realized you cannot give an inch to things that aren't right. And for me, as a physician, everything's based on evidence. And so while my focus also is on the kids, disagree a little bit with Dr. Goldfarb in the sense that we shouldn't be providing any care that's not evidence-based as physicians, even if they're an adult. I have had patients come and ask me to cut off their earlobes. Well, no, I'm not going to accept your money. I'm not going to do that to you. You need to see a therapist. That's where your money needs to be going. So I think that we have, as physicians, politicized this issue. I remember with beta blockers before surgery, this medicine, they said it's good to give it before surgery. Then evidence came out showing it was bad to give it. Then there was more evidence that showed it was good. And it went back and forth. Nobody politicized that issue. You go off of the best evidence, long-term evidence, peer-reviewed evidence, and you make the best decision based off of evidence, no matter what the topic is. And so you ask the question, what does this mean in plastic surgery? I tweeted this years ago. I think this is going to be a massive stain on plastic surgery. And I tweeted, in 20 years from now, when people look back on this stain on my profession, I want people to see this tweet and understand that I said something, I stood up, and I said absolutely not. Because there is long-term evidence out of Europe that has caused very liberal governments to stop performing these procedures and to stop providing the type of care due to weak evidence. And there is no evidence showing that the benefits outweigh the harm. So as a surgeon, imagine me or one of my colleagues coming up to you, Marissa, as a mother and saying, oh, there's this surgery. I know your kid's depressed. I know they're confused right now. They might even be slightly suicidal, which we saw a big ramp up after COVID and these kids being held home, especially in teenage girls. And I come to you and I say, Marissa, I know your kid's going through some stuff. I have a surgery I can do that has weak evidence, and I don't have great evidence showing that the benefits outweigh the harm, but let's go. Let me cut up your kid. What would you say?
Obviously, I would say no. But, Dr. Nazarian, Dr. Goldfarb, that what parents are being told by physicians, some of your colleagues, is not, I have weak evidence that your child should go through this surgery. What parents are being told is, if you don't provide these puberty blockers to your child, if you don't conduct surgery on them, the evidence says that they will commit suicide. I had Chloe Cole here on the show before, many people heard about her. I was heartbroken when she wrote in and said, I don't know what to do. Who's going to listen to my story? I'm afraid. Can you please, talk to me? And she said to me that her parents were told that she would commit suicide, and she believed that she would commit suicide if she would not have gone under the knife. So that's what we are told as parents, doctor. We are told that our children will commit suicide. They will be miserable. They won't be able to function. That if we want to be tolerant towards our children, if we want to be compassionate towards the suffering of our child that was born in the wrong body, we have to send them to the experts through these gender clinics. And what is your answer to that?
Yeah, well, no one should think that we don't think these children need therapy. The question is, what kind of therapy do they need? And when this begins, where the child suddenly is often indoctrinated in school, and I use indoctrination as thoughtfully about this. They come home and they say, I have this, I want to change my body. I want to change the way I look. I'm unhappy. And the parents fight. And then finally the parents and the child decide, well, we'll go to the pediatrician. The pediatrician sends them to the pediatric gender clinic, which now puts them on a train, puts them on the rails to go down this pathway. And our organization and people that are really thoughtful about this say, no. What these children need is psychological therapy. They need to understand why they decide they feel this way, because the vast majority of them are not children that express gender dysphoria, the so-called unhappiness with their gender, when they were 2 or 3 years old. These are mostly these days teenage girls, mostly girls, not exclusively, but mostly, who decide upon this as they're first entering into puberty, when they're really uncomfortable with their bodies. And this is seen as some sort of panacea that's going to relieve them of this discomfort. But what they really need at that point is to understand how they got this way, and also understand with a physician's aid or a psychologist's aid, that if they're left alone and they're allowed to go through puberty, a normal part of development, a required part of development, that they will come out the other end and be pretty normal people that will accept the way they look. Some of them may be gay, some of them may be bisexual, some of them may be heterosexual, whatever. They'll be normal human beings, intact, and not have to be medicalized for the rest of their lives. So what's really important is to find a therapist that can help these children through this. Now, understand there are states now, and I wish I could quote exactly which ones, but I think Michigan is one, I believe, where it's illegal. It's so-called conversion therapy to treat these children, which is absurd. The original studies of this were children that were 3 or 4 years old, typically young boys who wanted to dress up with dresses, play with dolls, and so on. And eventually they became adults. A small percentage of them wanted to continue to act this way. And the thought was, well, if we start them on medications early, they'll look like the gender that they're interested in. But it was an incredibly rare disorder. And it was something that was, rare. Most physicians never saw a case like this. Most pediatricians never saw a case like that. And suddenly now we're talking about having, a high percentage of the juvenile population in the country feeling this way. Well, obviously, this has become sort of a mania. It's become something like eating disorders, which can be transmitted from one child to another in schools, on websites, and so on. And, in my organization, Do No Harm, works closely with a woman, January Littlejohn, who I think is a typical story here. Her child was at school, and the school was starting to transition her child without January and her husband even knowing about this. And she spent the next 3 years fighting to save her child, which she did. And now she works with us as someone who helps parents and guide them through this. And I think what you said before is exactly true. The parents are coerced into this. And even though parents need to give consent, so one of the arguments is, well, parents have the right to give consent, but they don't have the right to harm their children. And they've been coerced into this through the path that you mentioned. They've been told, if you don't agree to this, your child will commit suicide. And it is untrue, as Dr. Nazarian said. It's untrue. That's not what the data show. What the data show, that if you match children with gender dysphoria and the kinds of psychological problems that they bring to the table, including autism, depression, anxiety, they've been abused, what have you, they don't commit suicide any more frequently than other children who don't have gender dysphoria with the same kinds of psychological problems. And I'll make one more point. In the largest study that was published in the New England Journal, which looked at about 100 children that were followed at a number of gender clinics around the country, of those 100 or so on children that were reported on, 2 of them committed suicide while they were in the program. So this is it's certainly no preventative for a child that's really severely psychologically disturbed from harming themselves. And it certainly doesn't precipitate it because they have this particular problem of gender dysphoria. So parents shouldn't be coerced, and children should be allowed to go through puberty, and they should be guided through this disorder, which it really is, through the help of a trained therapist who understands the problem thoroughly.
You talk about something that I now I refer to as the gender-affirming care pipeline. It starts in the school, then they go to a gender clinic to a doctor, physician, all the way through under the knife in the operating room, right? There's just this pipeline that we are now seeing, and is why we're so concerned. And when we look also at the numbers of the children that are pumped into this gender-affirming care pipeline, 13 to 17-year-old Americans, 9.5% of them are now identifying as LGBTQ+. You look at 50-year-old Americans, less than 2% of them identify as such. Now, people may make all kinds of arguments. Maybe the 50-year-olds are not as comfortable with admitting who they are, but that massive number seems to be some sort of data that doesn't make sense. How does it compute, right? There's obviously some sort of mechanism that is pushing more children and parents down into this gender-affirming care pipeline. And so when you talk about a child who is suffering from gender dysphoria, which is very interesting that you mentioned that it's usually 3-year-olds. I mean, it's usually a toddler thing because we're mostly seeing it amongst teenagers, as you mentioned. I want to emphasize this point. Parents like me are seeing young teenage girls identified with gender dysphoria, and boys. It's not so as much with 3 to 5-year-olds. So very, very interesting point. But the other point I want to make, and really to understand how to deal with this, is the fact that I don't know that I can trust the therapists. You're saying that if, God forbid, one of my friends has a child that is self-identifying with gender dysphoria, I should take them to a therapist. Doctors, I don't feel like if I take them to a therapist, their issue will be resolved. I'm actually concerned that they're going to actually push them into these gender clinics.
I share that concern with you wholeheartedly, especially therapists in California. I have to be honest. The first question out of their mouth is, what is your pronouns? What is your sexual preference? I agree with you. And I always joke that if there was some sort of classical therapist building with how therapy used to be performed, they would just be making so much money, because I think that there's a real
we don't know
need.
Where to go.
Yeah. So what I would say, and that I always recommend to other people, is interview the therapist, obviously, but I find therapists, even you can do it out of the country now. So I actually have had a lot of friends get therapists in South Africa for their kids.
Here, doctors? How do we get here where we need to go find doctors out of the United States? Because we can't trust the physicians in America?
There are some groups that help. There's Therapy First group that there are some therapists that have organized themselves to be the ones who that would provide supportive care and exploration rather than excision. I'll say. There are a number of groups, GenSpec. There are a number of groups that have organized themselves. Of our group, Do No Harm, that have organized themselves to help support parents. Dr. Mira Grossman works with us. She's a wonderful psychiatrist, written a number of books about this and has references in her books to groups that will support. So, yeah, you have to look around. It has to work. But parents need to understand that they shouldn't be coerced and they should stand strong for their children. And it is a very unfortunate thing. And of course, this is why our government now, in their wisdom, has said, we've got to stop this. We've got to stop this because this is something that has, occurred in a way that parents don't have control over things. And it needs to just stop. It needs to just stop and let these children go through their puberty. And it needs to be something that's not allowed. And at that point, then when they're adults, then they can start to try to sort through these problems.
We've seen some interesting Supreme Court cases. Tennessee just had an amazing victory in that. For those who haven't been following the case closely, I think it's a very important one. Tennessee did pass a law that said that gender-affirming care, puberty blockers, surgeries on minors were illegal. Then the government came in and actually sued them under the Biden administration. The case went to the Supreme Court, and on June 18th, recently, they actually sided with Tennessee, a victory for parents and children all over America. And essentially, they basically said, no, you can't mutilate a child, and it's not discriminatory to protect children because all of these children are protected, no matter what their skin color is, or ethnicity, or religion, et cetera. And so I'm curious from your perspective, what can the government actually do? What should we expect the government to do in order to protect children? And are the physicians going to be willing to go lockstep with the parents as well as the government in the effort to protect what is most important, which is our children?
I think it depends on what state you're in and how cult-like the mentality is, unfortunately, of the physicians and the parents. There's a disorder called Munchausen's by proxy, which parents, when we learned it in medical school, would actually cause medical problems in their children. Like one example we were given is the child had a cut and the mother would put dirt on it to get it to be infected so she could take the child to the hospital and get the attention from the physicians. So we know how rare it is to have a transgender child. Now, these mothers coming out with 3 transgender children, that's like a 1 in a gazillion chance that all 3 of your kids would be transgender. So we know that there's problems on the parent side, like a Munchausen's by proxy issue. And then there's problems on the physician side. And I'll give you an example. I have colleagues that just do gender transition in children. And when I approached one and I said, well, what about the long-term data out of Europe? He said, what long-term data out of Europe? And this is not something he does in addition to other things in plastic surgery. This is all he does. And to be willfully ignorant of the long-term data out of Europe, which has caused many European countries to pause and stop this type of care.
More than cause and stop. They actually shut
they
down
actually shut
the
it
clinics.
down. Exactly. And these are liberal governments, not conservative governments. So it's not political over there. They looked at the evidence. They looked at the long-term evidence and saw that there was no benefit, and they stopped the procedures. Even Netherlands, which was a country that was at the forefront of this type of stuff. And for him to say to me, I'm not aware of the long-term evidence.
This is the expert on gender surgeries?
On gender surgery in children and minors. And for him to say that means that either he's willfully ignorant or doing harm. Like it's a struggle for me because these people are my colleagues and they're nice people when I sit down and have lunch with them. But I don't know how to rectify it. And I was actually asking Dr. Goldfarb before we started this, like, how do I work that out in my brain? Are these people good people that think they're doing good? But in any other aspect, when we do surgery or when we do lasers, when we do an injectable on a patient, we give medicine to a patient, we're aware, or we should be aware, of the long-term data. Now, if this is your specialty and all that you do, that's even heightened further. And I just don't know how to sort that out in my brain.
Yeah, the literature is clear, and people should understand. It's not as if somebody did one study. There are now 17 systematic reviews. And let me just say, a systematic review is a very rigorous approach to the medical literature that says we're going to review studies that are valid studies. For example, there's a control group, or people actually measured what they did. And there have been 17 studies, the most recent of which was conducted by our government, Health and Human Services, brought in a bunch of experts to analyze literature and, again, made the same point. The famous CAST review in England, again, it was a systematic review done by the chief pediatrician in the British Healthcare Service. And they all came to the same conclusion, as Dr. Nazarian said. there's really no benefit that these children are better off. They're not less depressed. They're not happier. Some of them like the way they look. But the issue is, what's going to happen in 15 years? What's going to happen in 20 years? What's going to happen in 25 years? And we're starting to see, of course, lawsuits by such children who understand now that they've made terrible mistakes. So the literature on this is very, very secure when it says that there really is no benefit to these treatments. And these people, these practitioners, continue to ignore the data that's right in front of them. And unfortunately, it's not that rare an occurrence in medicine. It can take a long time before, when the medical literature proves something, before physicians fully adopt it. But in this particular case, we have people that are really pushing the argument. We go back to the Skrmetti case that you mentioned, just to talk a little bit about what the arguments were there that were pursued by the WPATH people, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which has created its own so-called guidelines, which are not really been evidence-based guidelines at all. But they supported fighting against the Tennessee law. And this is the kind of argument that they made. It was sort of interesting and bizarre. So the argument is that the law violated the 14th Amendment, which says that we can't treat people differently because of the way they look or their gender or what have you. And they said, well, look, if a boy comes into the hospital and says my testosterone levels are low, that boy could get testosterone in Tennessee. If a girl comes into the hospital and says my testosterone levels are low, and they're supposed to be very low, that's normal, she doesn't get testosterone. Therefore, we're not treating people equally on the basis of their sex. Now, you can see the absurdity of this, and the Supreme Court said, well, that's ridiculous. And the state can look at that and say, that's a ridiculous presumption that you're making, and therefore there doesn't need to be so-called strict scrutiny of the state law because it seems like such a rational law. And then there were some wonderful opinions by Justice Thomas and Justice Barrett who pointed out that, this is the science behind this, as Dr. Nazarian mentioned, really strongly shows that this is not beneficial to children. So that's what that law shows. Now, the Supreme Court said it doesn't violate the 14th Amendment. There are other amendments that people are claiming it violates. For example, freedom of speech, that parents are not given the right to control their children's upbringing and so on. So it's not the last case we may see before the Supreme Court with different arguments, but it was a crucial one. And it was the sort of case that gives energy to organizations like mine and Dr. Nazarian to fight against this, because now we know that we have legal backing to say this is not the right thing to do. We're not treating people in a discriminatory fashion. We're trying to save these children from a fate that really will be terrible for a great many of them.
Can I just piggyback off of the legal backing thing? Because, and what you were saying about the distrust in physicians, there's an absolute distrust in physicians. And I was actually wanting like a position in the administration called the truth czar. It'd be like trust restored under transparent healthcare was the truth, because you're absolutely right. When physicians don't act based off of evidence and act in a cult-like manner based off of their own ideology, you will lose trust in healthcare physicians, and they deserve it. I'm sorry.
Now all experts mean nothing to us. They mean nothing because experts have failed us.
That's
time
right.
And time again.
So when the experts have failed, right, it does require the law. It does require the government to step in and say, your informed consent that you gave to the parents that said your kid will kill themselves if you don't do this surgery is fraudulent. And that now gives legal backing for these parents or these detransitioners to sue, because you gave me a false uninformed consent based off of your ideology, not actual data, not actual evidence. So I think until parents and detransitioners sue, unfortunately, or until the insurance companies say, oh my God, there's all these lawsuits, we're not going to insure these surgeries anymore. Unfortunately, I think the ideology is so powerful, and we've seen a lot of mind warping in recent years where people will justify rape in a certain context or justify calling for the death of a certain group of people in context. Until this is put into place, they're going to mind warp. The physicians will mind warp to avoid long-term data, not see it, not pay attention to evidence, and just keep pushing their ideology. So unfortunately, the law and the government at this point does need to step in.
Well, one has to see a typical communist agenda, which is to basically ruin everything and then come in with big government and take over everything. And, we don't want that either. As Americans, we have freedom in our DNA. But when you talk about the Supreme Court case in Tennessee and the example that you give with the children and the young girl needing the same amount of testosterone as the young boy, it really comes down to a question that I never thought I would ask on TV publicly. Are boys and girls made different, right? This is what's crazy. To me, as a pedestrian, not as a surgeon and not as a doctor, it is pretty obvious to me that there are differences between the sexes. And I'm going to say this publicly time and time again. But I am having a harder and harder time finding physicians who are willing to say out loud, boys and girls are different. We have different biologies.
Boys and girls are different.
Boys and girls are different. And I think that is that. Now it's becoming case law, because in this case law, you have to start with the basic, obvious truth. Boys and girls are different. And this is what we're starting to see with physicians who are refusing to even identify on their intake forms whether the child or even the adult is male or female.
No, there was a hospital that actually, when the baby was born, it didn't just say male or female. It asked for sexual preference on the little card, on the little baby.
The parent? Who's supposed to decide that?
The parent decides what the preference is of the baby. I mean, it's gotten so ridiculous.
Well, this is why we can't trust the experts anymore, because the experts have lost their minds.
And I'll give you an example. There was a medical student a few years back that reached out to me that was a medical student in New York at one of the public hospitals. And she messaged me on Instagram and said, Dr. Nazarian, they're teaching us that men can have babies. What do we do?
What?
So I basically told her, you have to speak up. You have to speak up. You have to say, no, this is not biology. And they're so scared that they're going to get failed or they're going to get a bad grade. And I just want to put out there again, I have 3 teenage kids and they speak up like in a scary way for me in their classes. And one of the teachers of my son actually came to him at the end of the year and said, no student of mine has ever challenged me like you did. And I want to thank you. I mean, this couldn't be ideologically more different. So I just want to empower all students, whether you're a resident, whether you're in even doctors, whether you're at your society meeting, speak up. I'm typically the only one that will. And then when I go to our meetings, people come up to me in quiet and they're like, I support you. I back you. But I think people are just so scared to speak up. And I always say, having my family having escaped Iran where we didn't have freedom of speech, how sad is it that in America, people are afraid to speak? It's just, it's mind blowing to me where you have this freedom. If you don't use it, you're going to lose it. And we're seeing that people are so afraid to say something.
I think it's, Doctor, I think it's beyond freedom of speech. Don't you take an oath to protect us? Isn't that what you're supposed to do? It's not just your freedom. It's actually your obligation as a physician to do the right thing, to do no harm. How are your colleagues taking this oath and still doing harm despite all the evidence, the data, the biology, the obvious? How are they doing this?
Yeah, I think it's more sort of a question of there's a relatively small cohort of physicians who are accepting this and performing these procedures. And then there are a bunch of people who are doing nothing to do anything about it. And that's really the problem at these big hospitals. They don't want to end up with people at their office door with signs and so on saying that they're transphobic or what have you. Just to say the truth doesn't mean that you hate people that are transgender people. And I think, this has been sort of like cultish behavior. It's been a little bit of a grift by the LGBTQ plus community, because right now, marriage between 2 people of the same sex is acceptable in the United States. There really isn't much in the way of any kind of discrimination against gay people. They're in the cabinet. Secretary of Treasury, nobody cares. They had to come up with something else. And what they came up with was this idea that transgender people are being, that there's a huge cohort of transgender people, that they're not allowed to express themselves. They're allowed to express themselves. If there's violence that is foisted upon these people, well, that's bad, and that has to be prevented. But that doesn't mean that the rest of us have to accept something that is biologically ridiculous. There are two sexes. There's no such a thing as sexual fluidity. You're either a male or a female. And in fact, one of the arguments at the Supreme Court case was a critical argument, because to be a protected group in our country under the 14th Amendment, under the civil rights laws, it needs to be an immutable characteristic. It can't be something you adopt one day and then give up the next day. And the chief lawyer for the group that was arguing, the plaintiffs that were arguing against the Tennessee case, Chase Strangio, who's a transgender person, admitted that, in fact, this is not immutable, that there are people that are the so-called gender fluid. Some days they feel like a man, some days they feel like a woman. Whatever they feel like, they're still a man or they're still a woman because of the biology that underlies it. And this argument that, well, there are people with sexual abnormalities, and so it's really a spectrum, is ridiculous. I mean, it's like saying if you have congenital heart disease, that's a spectrum of normal heart function. It isn't. It's a disorder.
Right. Or if you're missing a leg, if you have an amputated leg, it doesn't mean humans don't generally have two legs.
Yeah. So that's a ridiculous argument, but it's an argument.
They're saying like people that are born with XXY or, they're, it happens. Right. We used to see it at Children's Hospital. Therefore, that's gender fluidity. But no, there's immutable characteristics that describe a dog. There's immutable characteristics that describe a bird. Same thing. A bird might have a broken wing or be missing a wing, but that doesn't mean birds in general don't have two wings.
What's particularly interesting to me, mostly because I'm a fighter, I'm a fighter, and that's what we do here at PragerU. We fight for truth. Is one category of doctors are like you, sadly too small, but they're fighters. Another category, probably the vast majority of people like humans, they probably agree with you, but they're not fighters, right? So they just hope that somebody else is going to do the fighting for them. Typical human nature. They don't start fighting until they realize it's too late, or they hope that others will do the work. And then there's a third category, the one with some sort of incentive and nefarious agenda to keep going with it. And my question to you, from the visibility that you've had, are there incentives to push the gender-affirming care? Are there financial incentives for doctors? Are there organizations and NGOs that are actually incentivizing an industry that is turning these children into medical ATMs?
There's the old saying that things like this that starts out as a cause, then it becomes a business.
Yes. And
it ends up as a racket. We're in the racket phase at this point, because when it was a business, people charged money, they got paid. Once it became clear that this was a false approach, a detrimental approach, and yet they persisted in it, then it became a racket. Mm. So again, I mentioned before our Stop the Harm database that people can go to and look and see what their local institutions are doing in this sphere. There was something like $150 million that was charged by these hospitals across the country, which sounds like a lot of money, but in the world of healthcare, that turns out to be still a relatively minor kind of expenditure. But nonetheless, people are being paid for these services. The physician you mentioned who does this as their full practice, that's their full practice. And most gender clinics have to have at least 100 or so patients in order to be a successful clinic. And there are about 100 of these gender clinics around the country. So, there's money being made here. I don't say that's the only reason they're doing it. I think a lot of not a lot, but there are many transgender physicians who are actually performing these procedures around the country. Mm. That's one thing. There are a number of people that are true believers. And then there are a number of people who just, really don't think much about it. And that's a very unfortunate thing. They believe they're doing the right thing. They refuse to look at the literature as you described. And that's what we're fighting against. Mm-hmm. What's really most disturbing to me are the medical organizations. Mm-hmm. So here you have the American Academy of Pediatrics, you have the Endocrine Society, you have the American College of Physicians, even the American Board of Internal Medicine. they all come out and support these activities. And in part of it is because organizations don't like to admit mistakes. And they made terrible mistakes. And the problem they've gotten themselves into now is that if they admit it was wrong, now they open themselves up to all the lawsuits. And there are a number of lawsuits that are going on now. And I should just point out that the problem for hospitals in the lawsuits is not so much that the insurance companies are going to bother them, which they will, but most hospitals have an important component of self-insurance. So they have to reserve millions of dollars a year to cover themselves because often there may be a state program that helps them for the first part of the lawsuit. And then their program kicks in after that. And finally, there may be a reinsurance program. Well, for a hospital, have to put aside a couple $100 million because they might be sued over the next 25 years. The bills that my organization are trying to generate around the country are the so-called Detransitioner Bill of Rights, where they'll be able to sue for many, many decades after the event, whereas now malpractice is only a few years. They'd have to reserve hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and that's going to put a tremendous cramp in their style for pursuing these activities. So, I mean, that's where we are in this, and I think that the lawsuit story is going to be the one that may bring it down. I must say, though, that there's a Dr. Malone who works with one of the SEGM, the Society for Evidence-Based Gender Medicine, who's been a leader against this field and made a statement to me once that I think was really very painful, but I think may be true. He said, this isn't really going to stop until the bodies start to pile up. And that's
so
really sad. It's going to be like fentanyl or other kinds of the opioid epidemics where no one became really concerned about it until the deaths really started to pile up. And then people understood. And then finally, laws were put into place and efforts were made to stop the procedures.
When you talk about it in those terms, the first thing that comes to mind is the Department of Justice. I know that Pam Bondi has been trying to fight this, and I'm wondering if you've been following the memo she released in April and her attempt to really put the consequence on actual doctors.
Yes. So basically a memo came out saying that this is gender mutilation, which is criminal in the United States under the age of 18, and it has a maximum 10-year sentence per count.
So a doctor would possibly go to jail for gender mutilation, which she is tying to the gender-affirming care.
Plastic surgeons in general are allergic to the word mutilation. So, these doctors and my colleagues who are doing this, are allergic to that word. And I try to be really careful with the use of the word because, again, in my brain, while I'm trying to sort out what it is that they're doing, I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. I don't want to say, they're purposefully and evilly mutilating kids. So I don't want to use that word. It's still a little hard for me, to be honest. But that is the word that was in the memo for sure. It's very difficult to me to look at my colleagues and say they're actively doing something to harm. And I think maybe they have a different definition of harm. I think Dr. Goldfarb and I see harm as an evidence-based thing. I think more and more in society, people see hurting people's feelings or saying or disagreeing with someone. Right. Simply just disagreeing or having a different opinion is harmful somehow or leads to a toxic environment. So I think that we're sort of living in this weird...
where words don't really mean the same thing to different people.
Exactly.
So what is mutilation and what is really harm and what is really tolerance?
Exactly. And tolerance, you mentioned before. Again, to these people, they see tolerance as not hurting someone's feelings. I see tolerance as every human being, as Dr. Goldfarb said, is worthy of therapy, worthy of love, worthy of being listened to, worthy of care. But it doesn't mean you do certain types of care that have no evidence. To me, that's harm.
Yes.
But to my colleagues, it might be that if I don't provide what they want, if I don't cut off the earlobes of this patient in my practice who asked me to do so, and he broke out in a cold sweat and ran out of my office. Did I harm him by not giving him what he wants? Or did I stay true to my core values that normal anatomy is what I should be delivering?
Right. And this is the chaos that we're living now in 2025, where truth doesn't really matter and is very unclear, and words are very unclear and very confusing. And and really, to bring it back, I'm sitting in front of two physicians that I do trust, and I know how many hours you put into your expertise, and I do trust you, and I don't trust many other physicians, but I do recognize that we cannot function in a society where we cannot trust experts.
Can I
right?
just make a mention of that too? I was so scared to speak up. I'm a nice, Persian girl. We're told to not rock the boat. Be
Well, if
patted
you're a
on the
physician,
head.
you had to comply for many years.
We
to follow
did, and I
tests.
was very compliant. I was teacher's pet. I wasn't this person that's like, I'm a fighter. Like, you might have been born a fighter. I was not born a fighter. But what I have to say is, when you do speak up, and it is the silent majority who's, looking around being like, I'm living in the twilight zone. When you do speak up, I'm just saying this to my colleagues who are watching, or anybody else who's afraid to speak up in a profession that they're afraid they're going to get canceled or lose. I was willing, and I thought I was going to lose all my patients. I'm just putting that out there. I was like, you know what? I did it. I set out. I accomplished it. And I'm just going to give it all up now, because my parents didn't sacrifice everything to bring me to America to shut up. And so I was willing to lose it all, but I just want everyone to know the exact opposite happened. And what you're saying is, I trust you, is exactly what I hear from my patients. They walk in, they know that they can speak. They know they don't have to walk on eggshells, and there's an inherent trust immediately. So when I recommend something, they're not questioning what is her motive. There's a trust there, and that's priceless. It's priceless for me. I don't get burned out because I don't have to explain with things 100 times. I just say, this is what you need. And there's a trust there. So as a physician, not getting burned out, it's been amazing. And to the patients, like you telling me that there's this therapy group that I was not aware of, that I can now refer to, that's amazing information. So having these physicians who speak up, who know what they think, and I've had patients fly in from all over the world saying, I came here because I like the way you think. And so again, I just think what you said is so powerful in that if you do speak up to the people, and I think my message to everybody is just speak up. More than agrees with you, and they're afraid to do so, but there's so many benefits that come with speaking up.
Well, I actually want to emphasize the importance of real good experts speaking truth. And you have worked so many years to get your degrees and your expertise. And let me tell you that physicians who are not speaking the truth are losing everything they worked for. Because if we don't trust physicians anymore, all of that which you worked for will go to nothing. And that is what's about to happen in our society. If experts don't stand up and speak the truth and find the courage, the price they will pay is way worse than the price they would pay for not being politically correct.
100%.
The price they will pay is that patients won't trust them anymore. And all the degrees that you have hanging on the wall will mean nothing. And that will mean a society in chaos. And so people really need to think about this. They need to think about this long and hard. Everybody has a stake in this game. Every expert who worked hard for their expertise has a stake in the game to be honest and trustworthy again, or they will lose everything they've worked for. And that will be something that our entire country will have to pay for.
Just to put a point on the issue about truth, realize that this is really the essence of what universities and medical schools and scientists should be seeking. And yet we have this idea in society now, this postmodern idea that the truth is all relative. It's your truth. It's my truth. It's her truth. And this is total nonsense. And, well, all this is going to lead to is just the agonies that we're seeing in transgender, so-called gender-affirming care, and some of the DEI issues that we're going to talk to. Again, there's no such a thing as the best physician. There's no such a thing as the best way to treat people. It's all, you do what you want, I do what I want. Everything is fine. There's no objectivity. And that's what we're really arguing for. We're arguing for objectivity. The data show that children that go through this are not benefited. That should be the end of the discussion and not the beginning of the discussion, which is really what's happened here. In the same way, as we'll talk about in a shortly, having discriminatory practices are going to benefit one minority group over another, for example. And no, there's a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things. And we have to seek the truth and we have to seek objectivity. And that's our job.
Well, Dr. Goldfarb, I'm glad you bring up DEI because that's another reason why we are not trusting experts. We are hearing that people are making it into medical schools, not because of their merit and their abilities, but because of, their skin color or their whatever DEI compliance is required there. And I know that you're coming out with a book on this issue. And so maybe you can tell us a little bit, what are you hoping to accomplish with this book? Can we save these medical schools from the DEI train wreck that they apparently have decided to take upon themselves?
Yeah, well, the book, it's called Doing Great Harm, ? And it's really my story. I've been through some interesting times speaking out. There is a price to pay. Dr. Nazarian has benefited, and I think I've benefited as well, but also I've lost some jobs and I've lost some positions and maybe not quite canceled, but close along the way. So it's a little bit about my story, but it's more importantly about the story of Do No Harm, the organization that we started in April of 2022. And our organization is a membership organization, which talks a little bit about what we can do about things and now we have over 24,000 members of Do No Harm. And what it means to be a membership organization is when one of our members finds something that really irks them because they feel it's unfair or even illegal, we can institute action in their name without using their name, but on their behalf. So we've started a number of lawsuits. We've won now 11 lawsuits around the country, and we've been able to push generate legislation that's now been passed in 26 states that restrict at some level or another gender-affirming care or block DEI initiatives. And our goal is really to get rid of all discriminatory practices in healthcare and not treat people differently because of their race, only when that's medically necessary, and occasionally it is, but to treat everybody the same and to have the best and the brightest individuals get into medical school and not have a situation where a Black student who has substandard grades has a 10 times better chance of getting into medical school than a white or an Asian student, for example, as our organization just showed at the University of Wisconsin, for example. So there are a number of schools like this and UCLA has been one of the worst actors in the whole story. And we've been part of a lawsuit now against UCLA and this is a class action lawsuit because their discriminatory actions in who they're accepting into medical school has clearly gone beyond the pale and now has led to, legal action on behalf of a student, again, a member, a young woman who was rejected despite having excellent grades because she wasn't of the right skin color, which is absurd in this country. So that's what we're about, and that's what we're trying to accomplish. And the book, again, tells the story and some of the efforts that we've made in this arena.
The question that comes to my mind as a patient is, has DEI actually impacted the medical field? Should I be worried if I go to the hospital? Is it possible that a DEI hire is going to mess things up and they were hired and somebody up there knows that they were hired even though they can't function? Are we at that moment in America?
Let me just describe the data the way I've seen it. And I wrote about this in my first book also, which is Take 2 Aspirins and Call Me by My Pronouns, a title that always draws a chuckle from people. But I went through the question of, what's the evidence that it makes a difference? What's the evidence that if you take someone into medical school who has lower MCAT scores, which is the achievement test for medical school, or a lower grade point average, that there's going to be some impact on the eventual provision of healthcare by these people? So we now know MCAT scores predict performance in medical school in terms of grades, in terms of faculty assessment. There are many studies that show this. We also now know from 2 very large studies that minority groups, remember that minorities are getting into medical school with lower MCAT scores as a group. Some of them have terrific scores and are totally justified in being there, but others are weighing down the group, and they're in as well. And if you take groups of minority students in residency programs, in 2 studies, one in internal medicine residency programs of 6 internal medicine residency programs around the country, and another study of emergency medicine physicians in training, in each case, the assessment by the faculty of the students was that they're performing less well. They have less medical knowledge as a group. Again, individuals, you can't look at one individual and say, you're weak because of your skin color. We're not saying that. We're saying as the group that's being accepted into medical school and getting into residency programs, as a group, they're performing less well. Emergency medicine, the same thing. They were less competent based on their medical knowledge, based on their preparation for practice, based on their professionalism as well. And finally, we know from certifying exams by the American Board of Internal Medicine that how well you do on the certifying exam predicts 30-day mortality and readmission to hospital by the patients of those physicians using data from New York State. So we have this trail of evidence that academic performance, as judged by grades, as judged by MCAT scores, as judged by faculty assessment, translates into healthcare outcomes. So yes, the answer is yes. There's evidence now that reducing the standards of medical school in order to accomplish a diversity goal, and we can talk in a moment, I guess, about whether there's evidence that a diversity goal is really a goal that schools should aspire to. But if you do sacrifice merit for diversity, you're going to produce a less qualified cohort of physicians. Amongst that cohort, they're going to be very qualified people, but there are also going to be others that are not qualified. And in medical school, unlike many professional schools, everybody that gets in finishes. Virtually everybody. It's about 98%.
But they don't finish because they're actually qualified to finish, but they get the same exam time and time again until they finish, so the school doesn't get sued.
They're carried through. The weak ones are carried through. They're given multiple chances to take exams. And one of the arguments, well, they passed their licensure exam. Yeah, but that's a minimal competency exam. And when you're lying on the surgical table and you're about to have your open heart procedure, you really don't want someone who was just competent to be the one who does that. And is it true
that they're allowed to take that same exact exam time and time again? And so they get to read the exam and study for it again.
If they fail it over and over, I mean, if they pass it, they don't take it again. Right. If they fail it, they keep taking it again. And a percentage of them continue to fail. They'll finally may succeed. But you have to understand that there's been such a tremendous emphasis on these multiple choice exams for licensure and even for medical school grades. And there's been these industries that have grown up providing all the questions, and they study these questions and they get pretty good answering the questions, but to the point where they can pass, not that they can perform outstandingly. But that's only one issue. The issue is, what's their overall academic ability and how has it been judged by the faculty that have observed them, for example, in the residency evaluations, or by their grades in multiple courses as undergraduates or in medical school.
Unbelievably scary.
There's actually a publication out of about UCLA Medical School where, they want the percentage of accepted students to reflect the percentage of that race in the U.S. So 13% Blacks, 1 or 2% Jews, and so on and so forth. And they were saying that 50% of the students were failing these competency exams, these shelf exams, we call them. And when they got to their clinical years and they're rotating through actual real life hospitals, they're being asked, what is this? And it's very basic, like the carotid artery. Everybody should know what that is. Not only do they not know the basic anatomy, but if you say, why don't you know this? As we all went through, we were all pimped, it's called, when you're asked a question in front of a large group of people. And if you don't know it, the embarrassment forces you to go study. They would say it's a hostile work environment.
Oh, of course.
The students are saying, I don't feel supported. This is hostile towards me. And so I'm afraid that overall, like Dr. Goldfarb is saying, these lowering of standards, how could it not lead to, it just makes sense. I'm glad he comes with evidence. But again, it just makes sense that if you lower the standards, and you're not as tough on people, they're not going to study as hard. There's going to be a lower fund of knowledge, and that's going to translate into how patients are treated.
We once had a lawsuit that Do No Harm put up against the state of New Orleans because, like many state medical boards, they have a requirement for a minority member. And we sued them over this because that's illegal. You can't have anything racist based on race. And I was interviewed on NPR, an object of some interest lately in the news. And I was asked, why is this so bad? And I said, it's bad for two reasons. One reason is it's against the law. But the real reason this is bad is it undermines the Black physician who gained the respect of their colleagues, was an outstanding surgeon or clinician in their hospital, was nominated for a state medical board, gets put on the state medical board, and now it becomes, well, they're there because of the law, because of this illegal selection process that they have, rather than their accomplishments. And, the brilliant Black student who's there in school is suddenly looked upon as someone who's there simply because of their race. It's terrible. It undermines their achievements. And, the Black intellectuals feel very, very strongly about this, that this is something that they really resent because they've accomplished things. I've been on panels with Ben Carson, for example, and they're very resentful of this idea that they got where they got because someone gave them a leg up simply through affirmative action. The time for that has ended. And I'll just finish to say that I can unequivocally say there is no qualified Black college student who wants to go to medical school who is not getting into medical school.
Yeah.
I'd like anyone to find one. There is no bias against Black students. There is, if anything, as I said before, in some schools, we've done a recent analysis that was a Wall Street Journal editorial. A student at Wisconsin, as I mentioned, a Black student has a 10 times greater chance of getting into medical school.
10 times greater.
10 times greater. And also, Black students were getting in with grades where whites and Asian students were being rejected. And this is the reality. But the Black student that really deserves to be there is, believe me, having no trouble being admitted to medical school, is sought after by every medical school in the country. And that's fine, as long as they're the top of the class. That's great.
There's also data showing that Asian students have to have a score on their SATs. It's 250 to 300 points higher than a Black student. In order to have the same consideration.
That is racism.
And I've actually taken this to DEI offices for schools that, we're involved with, and they'll just ignore it. It's this whole, it's just a very strange time that people just ignore what they want to ignore and take in what they want to take in, like it's selective data.
Well, the Supreme Court has said that's illegal. That was the Students for Fair Admission versus Harvard and North Carolina. And they're going to be held to task. Organizations like mine, the federal government is going to hold them to task that they have to abide by the law, whether they like it or not.
If you take a medical entrance or exit exam, do you need to identify your race on it? Do you need to identify whether you're Jewish? I mean, Christian? Is that something, like, how are they identifying that?
Religion, no. But when I applied to schools, it's interesting. I remember, there was a huge influx of Iranians into Los Angeles due to the, the revolution in Iran. And they were all trying to mark a not white in order to get into UCLA. And actually UCLA changed their category to say white, including Middle Eastern in parentheses, so that all the Iranian students wouldn't claim they're Asian or wouldn't claim they're, of some other descent, to try to make it easier to get in. So I know when I was applying to college and when I was applying to medical school, they did ask a race question. I don't know if that's still...
Yeah, we don't want this in America.
It's so bad.
We just don't want this. We want it to be a country where it's just based on what you can do.
Exactly.
One nation under God, right?
That's what we want.
So let me ask you a final question. You're both physicians. What is your prescription for the American people? What can you do right away that every person who is watching this can make some sort of a difference in our country so that we save ourselves from this chaos? I'll let you go first.
Two things. I think if you see something, say something. I think that that's the bare minimum. Speak up when you see, if somebody's telling you men can have babies, say something. I think that's number one. Number two is I'm actually writing my first book right now called Diversity of Thought and Life Experience Detail, which is going to hopefully be an alternative choice for people who are looking for an alternative to DEI, which has led to discrimination, divisiveness, horrible connotations all around, and sort of has not achieved what it was meant to achieve. So for all these organizations, whether it's in medicine or corporate or government that cannot possibly get rid of their diversity statement, but they're looking for an out, this is their out. We need to focus on a diversity of thought and of different life experiences. And I'll give an example. A child of an NBA basketball player who's Black, who's had 30 tutors and gone to the best private schools, and he's applying to Stanford. versus a white child whose mother is a meth addict. He grew up somewhere in the South and he had to ride his bike to the public library every day to get to the point where he can also apply to Stanford. Should the black kid of the NBA basketball player be given a higher chance of getting in, or this kid who had to bike every day to the public library to study with no support? So it's really about life experience. It's about that character. It's about everyone has a story regardless of these immutable characteristics. And also diversity of thought, which has been so lost in medical schools, in our societies, in schools, because people are just so afraid to say what they think. And that's so sad to me. So bringing it all together, it's don't be afraid to say what you think. That's what makes America great. It's the diversity of thought.
Doctor, final prescription for Americans.
Yeah, well, that's why I started Do No Harm, because the question is, what are we going to do? So the first thing I would say is if people join our organization, that will help. Doesn't cost anything to join, and it gives us the voice. And, you know, what we're talking about there is this threefold approach to this, which is to use the government as a tool to push when we have a government that's responsive to these kinds of issues. Secondly, to sue people and to hold people accountable, finally. And we've just started the Center for Healthcare Accountability that is going to be doing medical school grading, telling people exactly what's going on in these schools. So I think it sort of becomes a call to action. And you need organizations like ours. There are other organizations out there that are fighting, not so much in medicine, but in other parts of American life. So I just urge people. My book will describe, you know, what our organization has been up to, but I really feel strongly that we need to get together. What Dr. Nazarian said is absolutely right. Individuals need to speak up, but we also need a collective effort as well. And I think our organization it really helps provide that.
Well, thank you both, doctors. I love the prescription. And I also really want to personally thank you for bringing experts to be honest again, right? And allowing us to trust you all, because we do need you. We need to be able to trust you. And, you know, maybe one day every doctor's office we walk into will actually have maybe a certificate from your organization that says do no harm. And we can know that that's a sign that this is a physician that we can actually trust and is not either burying their head in the sand or simply complying with evil agendas. And so, again, thank you both for being here and for all the work that you're doing. Really appreciate you both.
Well,
thank you.
Yeah.